get started. I'm hoping you guys can hear me in the back. So, good morning.
Good morning.
Oh, it's more energetic than I expected for this early.
Huzzah!
So, my name is Herbert, and today I want to walk you through some adaptations we can make to our workflows when designing for iOS to kind of deal with everything Apple has thrown at us over the past year or so, because it's starting to get pretty crazy. I am a little bit worried because John, the organizer, asked all of you to use the app that you have, the 360 app, to provide feedback. And my talk does have an alternate title. If you're a designer, I will most likely piss you off at some point. So fair warning, there are definitely some changes that we need to make to our workflows to be able to keep up with Apple. And that's going to involve giving up some control that we're used to and obsessing over some things that we're used to. But we're going to come out of it, and I think it's going to be a lot better. So first, just to kind of let you know where I'm coming from, I've been on the SDK since it launched. And about 4.5 years ago, I went full-time consulting, doing iOS work. So work with clients. And I also love snowboarding. So much so, I have my own app out there, Slopes. It's like Nike Plus or Runkeeper for skiers and snowboarders. So I have a lot on my plate, and I do this all myself. I'm a one-man shop. I do both Photoshop, Xcode, work with marketing, generate my own marketing pages, client marketing pages. I'm all over the place. So with that much on my plate, I have to be ruthlessly efficient wherever I can. And Apple's certainly been making that a little bit harder over the last year. It's a really interesting time to be an iOS dev, though. It's getting really complicated for us, but I think we're kind of going through a transition phase now that was inevitable. And if we adapt to it, things are going to be fine. But they aren't the simple times that we're used to. Things are getting notably pretty complicated. So let's take a look at where we were and where we are today. Up until probably about 1.5 years ago, this is probably what your design phase looked like. Have Photoshop open, probably designing for an iPhone 5. You were designing it at Retina, 2x, so 640 pixels. You'd export everything, PNGs, JPEGs, just throw them in your project organizers, files that would ship with the project. Some of you, if you were daring, you might have an iPad app. It was most likely its own separate app. You weren't using universal storyboards where it could be the same app. If it was the same app, you'd have 2 separate storyboards. Simple times. As we are one to do as a community, we love mocking Android. So this is a chart that made its way around a couple years ago, and it was discussing the fragmentation in terms of design that Android had to deal with, not just the hardware fragmentation. So on the left was all the screen resolutions a hypothetical Android developer would have to deal with, and on the right is what we had to deal with iOS designs. Pretty simple, pretty nice, pretty easy. Started out with the iPhone. Then you got the iPhone 4 Retina size, which is basically the same landscape, just doubled. And then the iPad in the same pattern with the iPad Retina. Same basic design, just bigger assets, so not too bad. Now, unfortunately, this chart hasn't been updated for a while, so I want to go ahead and do that really quick. So a couple years ago, we got the iPhone 5, and that wasn't too bad. That was just an extra little bit of pixels down on the bottom. Throw a scroll view around your content, and it would work on an iPhone 4 and full screen iPhone 5. It wasn't that much we had to really worry about. But then last year, Apple threw us a lot. We have the iPhone 6, the iPhone 6 Plus with its new screen scale. We have display zoom. And if we're going to be honest, the chart on the left-hand side isn't necessarily honest either, as most charts online aren't. If you actually talk to an Android developer, this is more their landscape. Just like us, they have a couple key points they really need to worry about designing for. And even in that, you'll notice a pattern similar to ours, where it's pretty much the same aspect ratio, the same basic design, just different scales that they have to worry about. Like we had 1x and 2x. They'd have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They had much higher DPIs to worry about. But it was a pretty simple pattern for them. It wasn't as much of a mess as we like to play it out to be. So things aren't quite as rosy. And display zoom, something I just touched on, but I think we underestimate it. I grabbed it from Paintcode App's website. It made its rounds last year, kind of explaining how the iPhone 6 Plus resolution worked. And it just lays out when we're planning what the logical screens that we deal with is, the old classic 320s. And then it shows what we actually render at. And the display zoom callouts there, it's something I don't think we really appreciate how popular that is. So if you haven't seen display zoom, everyone actually gets a chance to turn it on when you set up your iOS device. Every user is prompted for it. And all they see is a prompt to say, hey, do you want to make things look bigger and easier to read? A lot of them say yes. I have been surprised how many times I've seen this in the wild. And what that ends up doing is either upsampling or downsampling the rendered screen onto the actual screen. So all our assets get completely messed up beyond our original control. They either get stretched or squished. Things get blurred.
So we have big assets?
Terrible puns. And the 6 Plus, even without display zoom, you're probably aware that it's already doing a resizing because it only has a 1080p screen. So we can't even, if the user doesn't opt into it, just by default, we can't assume that what we're designing is going to be how it's going to render. And it really was shown last year when the 6 Plus came out. Somebody tried to render that upper band on an iPhone 6 Plus. And the lower band underneath the microscope is what actually happened. On a Retina screen, the old 2X ones, it would be a one-for-one perfect look. On the iPhone 6 Plus, since the resolutions aren't matching up, things start to blur. They start to pixelate, stretch, band. And you might notice this, when you're flicking through a table view, you can kind of see it anti-alias weird. Most people don't notice it, especially most normal people, non-designers, non-developers. We obsess over it. And this is what display zoom is going to do. So if you've probably all actually seen it in action. When you had an app that wasn't optimized for the iPhone 6 and you ran it for the first time, it took the iPhone 5 design and blew it up to fill the screen. That's exactly what display zoom is. And on the 6 Plus, it takes the 6's app and blows it up to fill the 6 Plus screen. So it's always stretching stuff, causing this kind of imperfections. So the first way I'll piss you off is Pixel Perfect is dead in my book. And we need to stop obsessing over that. We don't have that control anymore. A lot of us are going to keep fighting it. It's fine, keep fighting the good fight. I'm not going to sell you all on that. But Pixel Perfect is dead, and if we kind of accept that, it's really freeing. And it's really going to make our workflows much better. Let's go back to this screen really quick. Everything we have to plan for. I wasn't entirely honest here. There's more. Comes out in about a month. iOS 9 adds multitasking, which is a great new wrench in our design workflows. So if you haven't seen it, what that lets you do is run two apps side by side. On an iPad Air 2, they can run half and half. On the older hardware, it'll just run in this little pull-out drawer as a temporary thing. And you might notice that looks a lot like an iPhone design running on an iPad. But it's not 320 pixels wide. It's not an aspect ratio we ever planned for. It's not something that we know, okay, we're on a phone, it's going to be this small, it's an iPad, it's going to be this big. Everything's out of whack now. So we need adaptive layouts. Yeah. We can't just assume that when it's running on a smaller screen, it might be 320 pixels. Now it's going to run on an iPad, and it could be half the screen, it could be a third of the screen, it could be a quarter. We don't know exactly what it's going to be anymore. So we need layouts that are going to respond to all these different sizes, and future sizes we don't know are coming. Now, right now, you're probably feeling a little bit similar to the end of Mike Lee's talk, doom and gloom. It's the panicking sensation setting in. There's a lot to deal with here, but that's why you're at this session. So let's go through it. I think, again, it's going to be okay. And there's another industry that went through similar changes reasonably recently, too. The web had what you've probably heard called the responsive web design. That was a big shift for them, and they had a lot of the similar pains that we're having to kind of deal with now. I think we can learn a lot from them. So on the web, when the iPhone came out, this is what the mobile web looked like, not the kind on the crappy cell phones with the, when you had a razor and it was just text, like the actual mobile web as we know it today. 2007, when the iPhone came out, it would just take our desktop designs and it would render them on screen And users could pinch and zoom in and out. If you're really daring, or a big company, you might have a mobile subdomain, so like mobile.amazon.com. And for those, you would be able to plan specifically that you would have somebody with a specific size screen coming to your site, and you'd optimize for that. This was the time of pixel-perfect compositions on the web. People would know on the desktop, okay, we're going to plan for about 960 pixels wide. That was kind of the default resolution width that you'd plan for. And you have the concept of the fold, which is still not dead, but it's dying slowly, where the idea is that any content below this point on the screen won't be seen by the user until they scroll. And people optimized around that, even though it was a complete lie, because everyone had different screen sizes, but people optimized so much for that. Pixel-perfect planning was a thing, even for your content, for your ads, for everything. And this is a lot like what things looked like before iOS 8. You had two separate unique entities, iPad app, iPhone app, and they didn't cross. Two separate code bases. Around 2010, and they existed a little bit before then, but 2010 is when they got popular, technology called media queries hit. So if you're not a web developer, CSS is the technology used to lay out your websites. And media queries is an extension on that that allows you to say, these set of layout rules only apply when these conditions are met. So for example, these set of layout rules apply when the screen width is less than 320 pixels. So with that, the web designers were able to go in and say, okay, well, this is how everything's going to work on mobile. This is how it's going to work on a tablet, how it's going to work on a desktop, with one code base, with one set of CSS. You could split it out into multiple files, but basically one set of CSS. It wasn't two completely separate websites anymore. And it was the same underlying content. It was just different layouts. So this is a lot like what iOS 8 is starting to look like for us. The idea of a universal storyboard that works on both iPhone and iPad that can be run on both devices and needs to adapt to one or the other depending on where the user's running it. So what can we take away from the web when they had to go through these similar struggles? The first one is designing at breakpoints. So when it was pixel perfect comp, you would obsess over exactly how this is going to look because you knew the resolution you were planning for. On the web, can't do that anymore. It could be run anywhere. So instead of trying to mock up what something is going to look like at every single potential resolution, that's a massive waste of design resources. What we do is we go ahead and we design a key breakpoints. That's what they call them. So you'll design what a hypothetical mobile site will look like, what a tablet, what a desktop, and maybe a desktop wide in case the user has a really wide screen monitor. And the idea is you're not obsessing over what it's going to look when you're in between. Those are things you're going to worry about at implementation time. But you're going to start thinking about that now. But you can't obsess over that because you don't have that control. Not to mention the fact your content was already going to screw all this up anyway when somebody gave you 3 lines of text instead of 2. But you stop obsessing over those in-between details and just start to get a really good overall picture of what things are going to look like. They also started using vector media. Now this was for a different reason. On the web, if you have 50 different icons that you need for your website, that's a request to the server for every single one, and a lot more bandwidth. It's a pain. So what they would start doing is they had font packs, a font that could be downloaded with the website, similar to Wingdings, the classical glyph font, where character A might be a paintbrush. So on the page, then, they would just use that font wherever they needed to render that icon instead of a static asset like a PNG or a JPEG. And a really interesting byproduct. When Retina came out, anywhere you were using a font pack generally, you didn't have to come up with new media. Since it was vector-based, it automatically looked sharp on a Retina screen. Everywhere you were using JPEGs or PNGs that you manually exported, you had to go back and export 2x versions of those now. Anywhere with vector media, it just kind of worked, which was great. And this is the hardest mentality switch I think we have to start to deal with, but it's going to give us the biggest payoff, is to start really thinking about the relationships of our content and how it's going to affect each other. So in Pixel Perfect, you didn't worry about that. You didn't worry about how things were going to reflow, what we needed to hide and show, stuff like that, because you knew exactly how it was going to render. We can't make those assumptions anymore. We don't know all of a sudden next year Apple is going to give us a split screen vertical. Who knows? So for example, the news listings there you'll see, it might be one single column on mobile and then it'll go wide on desktop. Or the hero image, where you have the text there on the hero image on desktop over top of the image. Since there's less room on mobile, it wraps it underneath. All those different ways of how is this smaller size going to affect our content and what happens when the content changes, what needs to push, what gives. And you probably won't see many web developers actually doing this, but it happens occasionally. The idea is to tweak these smaller details that we used to obsess over when it's actually in the code. Like I said, we can't afford to start mocking up, iPad split screen mockup and then iPad the drawer pull-out mockup and then a mobile mockup and all that. That's just a waste of our time in Photoshop or Sketch. So the idea is you start to have conversations about these relationships when you're doing that, but you start obsessing over those details and tweaking them when you're actually in the simulator, when you have something you can run with. And one of the big reasons for this you'll notice is as this is resizing, there are a lot of situations where if this was a Photoshop mock, you would think it was terrible. That US taking new approach to Cuba. It word wraps in so many ways that we would probably hate if it was a static mock because we're trying to obsess over all the little details. Right there, you'd hate that to Cuba on a second line. But we can't control that. Our content is dynamic. Our designs need to be dynamic, and we need to be okay with stuff like that. And this forces us to let go of that at design time. So Apple's definitely, some might say, been hurting us. But they've been giving us stuff all along to make this not that bad, to make this not too painful. They knew that this would be a big pain for us. We didn't start out like Android with fragmentation. We were used to one or two designs. And they knew that we would need new technologies along the way to be able to support this stuff. Oh, I will. Asset catalogs, they came along in iOS 7. So as I mentioned, a lot of us probably just dropped those JPEGs into the project solution and shipped it off. And then in code, you'd figure out if you need the 2x or the 1x. Asset catalogs are a way to specify metadata along with your images. So it's an image container in Xcode that you can go in and group images together and say this is all basically the same image, but this is divided out into the 1x version, the 2x version, or the 3x version. Auto layout came to us in iOS 6, really didn't stop sucking in Xcode until iOS 7 came out and Xcode with that. I've achieved Zen. It's not that bad. But that's a way to describe those relationships I was talking about. Before auto layout, what you had to do is actually figure out the on-screen pixels that a certain element would take up and try and lay that out yourself. And if you needed this piece of text here to reflow when this one changed, you'd have to carry that math all the way down. And it was pretty painful and error-prone. Not to say auto layout can't be error-prone. But now you actually get to describe your intent. I want this text to be 8 points down from the header. I want it to be 8 points in from the margin, and it'll recalculate things as that container might resize. And last year, they gave us universal storyboards and size classes. So universal storyboards is the way to have one storyboard in Xcode that works on both iPhone and iPad. And then size classes is what they gave us within that to be able to say, we need to adapt to different size containers. So the way that works is you have regular and compact right now, till we get our hypothetical Apple TV with large glass. And an iPad is regular height by regular width. An iPhone is a compact width. Turn the iPhone landscape, you're now compact by compact. It's a very generic way to describe what kind of situation you're in. And this is what powers that split screen multitasking. When you're split in half, you're no longer regular by regular on the iPad, you're compact width. Same as you're on a phone, even though it's a different resolution, but it's still the same concept. You don't have that full room to take advantage of, so you need to scale down a bit. So we've seen what the web's gone through and what we can learn from them. We've seen what tools are available to us when we're in Xcode past the design phase. So I want to go through how I've put all this together with my design tools to show you what I've kind of settled on as my workflow now whenever I'm dealing with iOS development. So starting with your favorite design tool, I work with 2 breakpoints. I work with the iPhone 6 and the iPad. I don't mock up the iPhone 5, the iPhone 4. I just start with those two because that's enough to start letting me have these conversations about how does my content relate to each other? How does it need to adapt? It gives me a framework to start having those discussions either with myself or with the team that I'm working with. If I can do something special for the iPhone 6 Plus in its rotated mode, I might do that, but that's a pretty rare one-off example. I'll work at 1x, which is a big change from how we used to do things. Most of us probably worked at 2x whenever you were in Photoshop. I actually dropped down now to 1x. The math is a lot easier. And perhaps most importantly, I stick to vector wherever I can now. And that's made things a lot painful. So I have 15 years of Photoshop experience. I've been using it since a long time ago. I have muscle memory. I'm fast, proficient. I love Photoshop. Wow, love to hate it. But it's great for my workflow, but I'm starting to feel the pains of it. A lot of the workflow I'm going to flow off, you can still adapt it to Photoshop, but it's really going to shine if you give Sketch a shot, mainly because Sketch is all vector-based. It's kind of optimized for the situations that we have to deal with nowadays. If you try and pull a vector asset into Photoshop, it's going to turn it into a bitmap, and then you get pixelation if you stretch, and it's not as nice. So Sketch is kind of the default I'm trying now. I'm still occasionally drop back to Photoshop. You could do that. Whichever one I'm in, though, I'm going to use whatever vector is available to me as much as possible. So fill layers in Photoshop, paths, shapes, stuff like that. If I am in Photoshop, I'm going to use their vector tools. But in Sketch, that's just the default, so there's nothing to worry about. So if we have one of my designs in Sketch, like I said, I'll work at 1x. And this actually works out great because as a developer, this is already how I think. When you're in Xcode, it doesn't care that you're designing for a retina screen. That's still the number of points I have to deal with on the screen. The fact it's a retina screen is hidden from me until it actually runs, and I just give it better assets. So if you're working with yourself or if you're working with a team, the handoff from design to development is going to be a lot less error-prone. You don't have to go in and half all the numbers when you're calculating what's that margin. There's a lot less room for error. Whenever I drop any of those icons in that we'll get from icon packs, I always grab the vector one now. So all the icon packs that we love, nowadays they always come with a PDF or an EPS or AI file or some kind of vector-based format for those icons that they're also shipping as PNGs for you. And the great byproduct in Sketch here is that when it gets dropped in, if I need to resize it, it's vector-based. So even in my designs, it's just going to redraw that bigger. It's not trying to stretch it. It's actually just completely redrawing it for that new resolution. And if I'm ever dropping in those pictures there on the left-hand side, if I'm ever dropping in non-vector media, I'll drop in the biggest version I can. Because later when we go to export, both Sketch and Photoshop, they call them smart objects. The idea is that the program will actually store the original version of that file. So when you're resizing it on your canvas, it can recalculate it based on that full resolution source image. It's not taking the image and shrinking it and then pixelating it as it blows it out. It's always recalculating it for you. And then everything else you see up here, I'm going to work with vector, all those lines, everything. That's always just a vector path, which again in Sketch isn't any special mode. It's just how you draw. Photoshop, use your shapes if you can. And when I'm in here, I'm going to start thinking about the relationships. How do the dates relationship to the pictures? What happens if I need to truncate something, line wrap something? Start trying to think through my content and how this might adapt. And even wacky things like what happens if the screen size is cut in half width? I don't know. But those are the kinds of things I need to just start thinking through a little bit now so I can start having a good understanding of how the content relates to itself. In the design phase, there's nothing like being able to put it on your phone and see and touch it. So if I'm in Photoshop, I love the app Xcode. It lets you mirror any window on your desktop over wireless to your phone, and it'll just render it right there. One big downside, though, is that if you're working at 1x and you're rendering it on your phone, it obviously has to stretch it to fill up your entire phone screen. So Sketch has a built-in mirroring tool in itself. And because Sketch is vector, when it goes to mirror to the phone, it's actually going to go ahead and re-render it at your phone's scale. So it's going to look like you're dealing with a Retina design on a Retina phone, as opposed to the fact that you're working at 1x on your desktop. So it still looks really smooth, really great. And you don't get that annoyance of seeing a 1x design, a non-Retina design. So when I have my designs done, I've gotten buy-off from the clients, worked with the team, it's time to get it into Photoshop. It's time to export all the assets I'm going to need. And at this point, I'm going to use asset catalogs wherever I can. There's no excuse not to use them anymore. I mean, not that they're hard to use, but just use them by default. So when I have a vector-based asset I need to export, I'll go ahead and I'll export that as PDF. Asset catalogs support that just fine. And one interesting thing is when you export a PDF, it still has the concept of what's the base size of this vector asset. So in this case, that stopwatch is 16 by 16. The PDF is going to contain that information even though it's vector. It knows what size I laid it out as. And Xcode is going to be able to pick up on that later. So same as when you drop a JPEG into Xcode and it knows, oh, this is the size of the image, and automatically lays that out for you, it can do the same with vector-based media. Vector-based still has that concept even though you can stretch it out and it's going to redraw. When I export as PDF, one nice byproduct is I only have one asset to deal with. If I need to later go back into Sketch and re-export things, I don't need to remember, okay, grab the 1x, the 2x, the 3x. It's just one file, put it into Photoshop, and it'll take care of the rest. Now, PDF is my default, like I said, but there are a lot of situations that vector media just isn't going to work in Xcode. There's a lot of media that it's just not good for. Something with a lot of image detail, some gradients, some photos, stuff like that, it's not vector media. It's not paths to be drawing. It's a raster file, and that's fine. So I'm working at 1x, so the math is really easy. When I need to export 2x and 3x, I can just go in and rescale it by 200% or 300%. Now with Sketch it's great because since everything's vector-based and I have those big original images backing it, if I blow up my entire canvas by 300%, it's going to redraw all that vector form. And I go to export it and it's still going to look smooth. In case you can't tell, vectors are important. So you could export one asset at a time if you want, blow it up to 300%, export, go back to 1. Or you could just do the whole canvas. That's usually how I'll work. I'll do a pass for my 2x assets, a pass for my 3x assets. You can do this in Photoshop too. If you're dealing with a 1x design, you can do a resize. So if you have a fill layer and you put a gradient style on there, it'll blow that up for you. And you can export those. So you can do the same dance there. It's not limited to Sketch. But again, those vector assets aren't going to resize quite as nicely. Let's go to catalogs. So like I said, that's the idea that I have all these images and I'm able to associate metadata with those images now. So Xcode understands something about those images besides the fact that they're image media. So in this case, that photo I just exported on the previous screen, I've gone ahead and said this is the 2x version and this is the 3x version of that media. And Xcode now understands that. And iOS will understand that. In this case, I skipped the 1x because it's an iPhone app and it's running on iOS 8, so I don't really need to worry about 1x anymore. So I can go in and group it all together under activity shot blank. So anywhere I reference it in Interface Builder or Xcode, I just call it by that name, not activity underscore shot underscore blank.jpg or at 2x. Just say that, and the system's actually going to look at what device you're running on and give you the 2x version or the 3x version as needed. You don't need that dance in code with some kind of macro or anything anymore. It's all managed for you through the asset catalog system. You can even go in and you can see universal is there. You can say this is the iPhone image and this is the iPad image and have different ones for that. And you don't need to deal with that in code. It's automatically going to do that. If you're doing anything with OpenGL, you can now do it based on how much RAM is there, if it supports Meta or not. Xcode 7 added a lot of new stuff this year for even more kinds of metadata you can separate your assets out by. And part of the reason they did that was iOS 9 as app slimming, which is the idea that it's only going to send the assets to a device that device can actually use. So if you download an app on an iPhone 6, you're not going to get 1x assets and 3x assets anymore. It's only going to ship the 2x assets, which for users is a lot of little savings of storage size that's going to add up over time as more and more apps adopt this. And the great thing is it's free. If you're using asset catalogs, there's nothing to do. Just make sure your metadata is right and you get it for free. The downside in here with dealing with raster media is if we ever get a hypothetical 4x screen, I have to go back to Sketch, export a 4x version, bring it in. Not the end of the world, but I have to go through that dance. So this is where using vector media by default is going to be great because there's just the concept of all, and that's it. This is another point I'll piss off designers. The way this works is Xcode will take that PDF and it will generate a 1x version, a 2x version, and a 3x version at build time and ship those PNGs off with the app. So the code, it's still PNGs, but the build takes care of that. And some people don't like that because you have to give up the control of obsessing of exactly how that shadow in the PDF might render. You know, the subpixel rendering that we obsess over, you don't have that control anymore. Now, I haven't ever seen a practical case since I've been using this where I noticed this on my app as I'm running.
So basically you're saying if you're a designer, you should start doing like pixel art games because that's the only way you're going to be able to control it.
Yeah. So I don't notice this. It's a trade-off I'm willing to give because I don't have the time to obsess over this kind of stuff anymore. Some of you might. But like I said, when you actually click on that, you'll notice the size down there, 16 by 16. Xcode recognizes what size they had this in Sketch. And it's automatically going to carry that through. So I don't need to hard code anywhere in my code that this was a 16 by 16 vector that you need to render at this size. Xcode knows that when I exported it. So there's no real inherent extra work here for vector support. It's just export as PDF instead. So I've gotten all my assets into Xcode. And now I want to start building and actually running and start laying things out. So this is where I will use Interface Builder by default. And I'll use auto layout for everything. Even if I have to drop into code for some auto layout, it's no more frame-based layouts. I'll tweak for the iPhone 4, the iPhone 5, the iPhone 6 Plus. In the simulator, I'll obsess over those details later, like you saw with those resizing browser windows. And I'll use size classes everywhere. I'm going to stop thinking in terms of iPhone versus iPad and start thinking in terms of a regular width container and a compact width container, more generic. So auto layout is an easy tool to abuse. It's really tempting, especially when you haven't achieved Zen with it yet, to just get the damn thing to work. And I get that completely. But all those conversations that you had about how your content relates to each other, this is where that really comes to a head and you implement those relationships. So I might just want to pin that image in the center 8 points over and pin the text 40 points over from the left-hand side and call it a day. It works. Never click auto-generate constraints, never. In this case, that image, what I actually intend is that it's always going to be 8 points from the side and 10 points from the top and bottom. So I'm going to pin it like that. So if the cell needs to stretch for some reason, that image is going with it because I don't want it just sitting there in the middle with more and more white space growing. But then I need to be able to say, okay, well, it's going to look stupid if it just grows in height. So you can 1-to-1 aspect ratio that. So now that image is going to grow both height and width as the cell starts to resize. If the cell shrinks, the image will shrink too, still keeping its same proportions. That text, I want it related to the image, not the side of the cell, so when the image grows, the text moves with it. So that date, I'm going to pin to the right-hand side of the image. The rest of the text, I could pin it to the image, but the generic relationship I'm actually trying to describe is that should all be left aligned. So I'm going to pin all those up to that date to group that text together. So it's kind of one unit. I'll pin the date to the top of the image and the number of runs to the bottom of the image because that's kind of my content area there. And then I'll just pin the resort underneath the date. There are a million ways I could have done this, and certainly ways that if I was in a rush, just throw it in and it would work. But it would work in this one situation. But as things start to change, not having the relationships actually described as how you intend them to work is going to really start to bite you, and you're going to have to go back and redo a lot of stuff. So really take the time to learn auto layout, not be intimidated by it, and then also to plan out and describe your relationships accurately. So once I have it working, I'll boot up the iPhone 6 sim, tweak some stuff, auto layout breaks, tweak some stuff, keep going, rinse, repeat, and I'll get pretty happy. But then sometimes those relationships I described need to be conditional. It's not going to be a one-size-fits-all. So in Interface Builder, whenever you're dealing with constraints, you're going to have those little pluses there on the side for things that you can tweak in those different size classes. So installed, for example, if you were to click that plus, you could start changing how it behaves on a compact width device. And these aren't just for iPhone versus iPad anymore, remember. If you're dealing with an iPad app, you now pretty much have to do this because you're going to have compact width situations with that split screen multitasking that users will expect from you. A great thing about doing this all in Interface Builder is it actually deploys back to iOS 7. You can't use size classes in code on iOS 7, but any size class work you do in Interface Builder will deploy back to that. So you do not have to be an iOS 8 only app to support this kind of stuff. So in this example, let's say on a compact width device or situation, I want that top constraint of the date to just not exist. I'm going to define it somehow the way. So I can just uninstall that constraint. You see the plus sign up there by constant. I can go ahead and tweak that margin in different situations. And it's not just for constraints. You can add and remove entire views from your view hierarchy using size classes like this. So it could exist in compact width, but not in regular width. Xcode 7 added the ability to do this for font sizes. So if you're in a smaller width situation or a smaller height situation, you can actually now just tweak your font size in Interface Builder, and it's automatically going to change that for you instead of having to drop in and detect resolutions in code. Obviously, this is great for one-off changes, but sometimes that's going to be way too much if you have to change your interface for an entirely different situation. So if you ever look at the bottom of an Interface Builder, it usually says any width, any height. Just click that, and you can use that interface there to start saying, okay, any of the changes I'm making now only apply to compact width. So it's not going to touch all that layout that you meticulously did for the default. It's now going to, if you delete a constraint, it's only going to delete it for compact width, for example. And the new one that you apply is now only applied to compact width. So it limits what you can affect, so you don't have to worry about accidentally overriding a lot of changes here and there. So once I've defined all my relationships, I open the simulator back up and hop all the way back down to the 4S, all the way up to the 6 Plus, run, tweak. And the great thing is at this point, if I've really thought through my changes, my relationships, a lot of this is just iterative work. It isn't massive sweeping changes. If you've really thought things through, it's small tweaks because it didn't perform quite how you expected it. So those are some big changes, especially from the Photoshop 2x workflow that most of us are used to. You know, designing at 1x, using auto layout, size classes, universal storyboards. It can be a lot. So that's how I do it, but I want to show you really quick. It did pay off for me big time. This is something that's I'm using day to day, and I want to show you how it paid off. So one of my client apps, it's a newsreader for sports rumors, and they approached me last July right after WWDC. They wanted it to work on both iPhone and iPad. So this is the first app that I really got to use this workflow end to end. I forced myself to really think about how I'm going to need to change and stop using Photoshop and really embrace this all the way. So at that point, I got iOS 8 buy-in because adoption numbers are pretty good for iOS. So they said, sure, let's go for that. So I used storyboards, I used size classes, I used asset catalogs. I didn't have separate storyboards for iPhone, for iPad. I didn't even think iPhone versus iPad. I really forced myself in the mentality of size classes with regular width, compact width. I used all the new adaptive stuff they gave us last year for how pop-ups look that work on multiple devices. And the great thing is, when the 6 Plus came out, we were in late beta, holding off for the inevitable hardware changes I knew were coming, and I went ahead and I booted this up on an iPhone 6 Plus, and I checked my commit log, and the only thing I needed to do is we had placeholder images there for the news stories when they didn't have an image associated with it. There were 3 JPEGs I needed to export at 3x. I brought them into my asset catalog, and I was done. That was it. I know a lot of people are suffering greatly trying to adopt for 6 Plus with frame-based layout, and it wasn't bad at all. You might have to tweak a thing or two, but overall, it's usually not that bad. And this year, I got payoff again for free. So at WWDC, it was pretty interesting when this was announced in the keynote. If you were in among developers, half of them were pretty excited about this. This was pretty cool stuff. The other half groaned very audibly, very loud. And that's because they weren't using auto layout, they weren't using all the new stuff, and they knew how much of a pain this is going to be to support. Because like I said, that pull-out drawer, that's not an iPhone pixel perfect design. It's slightly different. So me, I was one of the excited ones. Ran back to my hotel room, got the betas, waited 5 hours on crappy hotel Wi-Fi, finally got to boot up this project and look at what it was going to look like. I didn't go to the 360 website right away. I grabbed these a couple days ago. But this is what happened. I had no changes to make for the stuff that Apple threw at me at WWDC this year. It just worked. Split screen, the slide out drawer, everything. It just worked. I actually didn't have to make any tweaks. I'm not saying every time you won't have to make tweaks. Sometimes they're going to throw us something that you're not going to plan for. This isn't something that's going to solve all your problems. But if you really start to think about things in terms of relationships and not pixel perfect compositions, you're going to be much more ready and flexible for when situations like this come up. On top of that, I got asset catalog slimming for free. So when iOS 9 launches in about a month, all the users who download my client's app, they're going to start saving space because I was using asset catalogs. Not a huge deal, but all this is going to add up, especially on people on 16 gig devices because Apple refuses to kill those. So for me, it's worth it. I've already seen huge benefits. This is my default workflow for everything that I do now. That app was the first one I got to use it fully end to end. I'd been kind of working towards it. That was my first test. But this is my default now, and it's been great. There's a lot there. So what I want you to really take away from it, if I haven't hammered it enough, think in terms of relationships, not pixels. We have to give up that control. We have to be adaptive now. We're not going to be obsessed over the same details that we used to be able to and still not go crazy. If you want to, more power to you, but I don't see that as an efficient use of my time anymore. Don't think in terms of iPhone versus iPad anymore. We can still kind of get away with it thinking on just an iPhone app, but if you're working on an iPad app, that's out the window at this point. Who knows what Apple might do on the iPhone? So I'm not willing to think like this anymore. Start thinking in terms of size classes and start thinking that that regular or that compact width situation could be 500 pixels or it could be 300 pixels and start to really plan for how that's going to need to push and flow. Give 1x a shot. The math works out a lot easier. It's better handoff to your developers, or if you are a developer, it's great for yourself. Use auto layout. I'm hoping, based on the popularity of the auto layout session I saw yesterday, that people are finally really starting to get the idea that we have to do this, but do this, please. I know it's a pain in the butt, it's intimidating, it's a new way to do things, it certainly caused me a lot of stress when I started, but now that I've kind of achieved the zen of auto layout, as some people call it, I don't fight the system that much, and it does so much for free for me now that I just don't have to deal with it. It's a new way of thinking, but embrace it. You're going to have to. And lastly, give vector-based design a shot. I still love Photoshop. I still have to drop into it every once in a while, but I'm starting to feel the pain of using Photoshop because it doesn't support vector assets. And those have really made my workflow so much faster. End to end, I just can keep sticking vector and everything supports it, and it's great. I don't have to drop back into Photoshop a lot to re-export things when all of a sudden, when running, I realize, shoot, I needed that to be a slightly different size. It's not nearly as painful as it used to be. And there's less room for accidentally forgetting to export versions of media. Keeps it in sync so much easier. I think if you follow these 5 things and really embrace those, you're going to be okay. There's a lot more that I think you can embrace from this talk, but if you really focus on these 5 points in your workflows, I think you're going to be much better off than you were a year ago or this summer when they announced all the iPad stuff. So thank you. So if you, I guess